You know, when you break a bone, there's like a weird comfort in the process, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like you go to the hospital, they stick you in an X-ray machine, and the doctor just points to this glowing screen, and there's this jagged white line. It's binary.
Right. Broken or not broken.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
don't have to debate the philosophy of the fracture. You just look at the image, diagnose the problem, and put a cast on it.
It's incredibly comforting. I mean, human beings are pretty much wired to crave that kind of visible, easily categorized diagnosis. We really want a clear cause and a clear effect.
Right. But then you step out of the hospital and into the real world. You look at human conflict, at generational identity, historical trauma.
And suddenly the X-ray machine is completely useless.
Literally useless. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, it's murky, it's constantly shifting, and it's just incredibly complex.
Which is exactly when our brains tend to panic, honestly. When the waters are that muddy and we can't see the jagged white line, human beings have this terrible habit of just inventing a simple story to replace what we can't clearly see.
Yeah, we just make one up.
We do. We create a villain, we create a victim, and we call it a day.
And that deeply flawed human habit is pretty much exactly what we are dismantling today.
So if you are listening to this, you are the third person in the room with us, and we are so glad you're here.
Definitely.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a brilliant set of analytical research, a document titled Palestinians.pdf. And this text essentially attempts to build an X-ray machine for human conflict.
It really
It
does.
provides this highly structured framework for understanding the evolution of Palestinian identity. But more importantly, it breaks down the exact historical and psychological mechanisms of how prejudice, narratives, and systems of conflict actually form over time. Now, just to set the table for today, before we really get into the weeds here, because this is crucial, we're dealing with one of the most historically complex, emotionally charged, and widely debated topics on Earth.
Oh, without a doubt.
So our goal here isn't to play politics. We are absolutely not here to pick sides, left or right, and we certainly aren't here to endorse any specific political viewpoints or policy positions.
None at all.
Our sole mission today is to impartially unpack the mechanics presented in this specific analytical framework. We want to help you understand the document's structural breakdown of how narratives are built and how systems operate over time. That is our boundary, and we're sticking to it.
Which is honestly the most refreshing way to look at this, I think. And the core aha moment of this entire framework, the thing that immediately forces you to rethink your assumptions, is the idea that identity isn't static.
Right, it's not a fixed object.
Exactly. If you try to analyze this topic by treating, Palestinians as one monolithic group that has always existed exactly as it does today, you're going to fundamentally misunderstand the history.
Completely.
The research argues that to really understand the modern reality, you have to look at the regional populations of Palestine as people who evolved into a modern national identity, driven by very specific, often deeply traumatic 20th century political developments.
It's a journey from the local to the national. And to really grasp that, we have to rewind the clock way back. I mean, we can't start in 1948. We can't even start in 1917. We have to start in the Ottoman Empire.
Let's do it. We're talking about the pre-modern era, specifically Ottoman Palestine, which spans this enormous chunk of time, roughly 1517 all the way to 1917, 400 years.
It's a massive era.
And the core insight here completely shattered my modern assumptions. In, say, 1850, identity wasn't Palestinian in a nationalistic sense at all.
Not even close. If you walked up to someone in a village near Jerusalem in 1850 and asked them what their identity was, they wouldn't pull out a passport or, point to a nation state on a map.
Right.
The concept of the modern nation state barely existed in the region at that point.
So identity was intensely local, and it was primarily religious or occupational. The framework breaks down the distinct subgroups living in the region at the time. You had Muslim Arab peasants, known as the fellaheen.
Right, the agricultural backbone.
Exactly. These are the people intimately tied to agriculture, working the exact same land generation after generation. Then, totally distinct from them, you had the urban elites living in cities like Jerusalem, Nablus, and Jaffa.
And those elites were a completely different world.
Yeah, these were merchants, administrators, people tied into the broader Ottoman imperial economy.
You also had deeply rooted Christian Arab communities who were often involved in trade or specific artisanal crafts. Plus, you had long-established Jewish communities, which the research carefully notes were pre-modern, deeply religious communities.
Right, not the political movement yet.
Exactly. They were not part of the later secular political Zionist movement that would emerge in Europe. And on top of all that, you had Bedouin tribes operating with completely different social structures moving across the deserts.
So if I'm trying to visualize this, it's kind of like, imagine trying to describe your identity 300 years ago in Europe or early America. You wouldn't say, I am a citizen of the United States.
Well, you wouldn't.
You'd say, I am John, the blacksmith from the River Valley, and I belong to the Methodist Church on the hill. Your identity is your hometown, your religion, and your trade.
That is a perfect parallel. And because identity worked that way, prejudice worked that way too.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, during this 400-year Ottoman period, the conflict wasn't some nationalistic Palestinians versus outsiders dynamic. The tensions were largely based on class and rural versus urban divides.
Like the farmer resenting the tax collector?
Exactly. It was the rural peasant resenting the wealthy urban elite in Jaffa who was taxing them. Or it was about where your specific religious community fit into the broader, hierarchical system of the Ottoman Empire.
But then the 19th century rolls around. We hit the late 1800s and early 1900s, and things start to shift globally.
The world starts getting smaller, and empires start getting weaker. This is what the framework calls the early national identity phase.
Okay.
You have the seeds of Arab nationalism stirring in the broader Middle East. Intellectual movements in places like Beirut and Damascus are starting to talk about an Arab identity rather than just being Ottoman subjects.
And concurrently, in Europe, you have the rise of early Zionism in response to rampant, horrific anti-Semitism, which leads to increased Jewish immigration into Palestine.
And this is where the material reality on the ground begins to physically change. It's not just philosophical debates in coffee shops anymore.
The research points out that tangible land ownership tensions begin. You have a sort of proto-Palestinian Arab identity starting to form, and the drivers of prejudice shift entirely.
Right. It's no longer just the village farmer annoyed at the city merchant.
The anxiety becomes about land displacement, cultural shifts, and the very early rumbling stages of two competing national movements eyeing the exact same soil.
Which sets the stage for a massive structural rupture. The single event that truly forces these loose local identities to harden into something defensive and national.
The collapse of the Ottoman Empire. World War I ends, the Ottomans are defeated, and the British take over the region.
A total paradigm shift.
We enter the British Mandate period, from roughly 1917 to 1948. And suddenly, those subgroups we talked about become much clearer and a lot more rigid.
Because the environment demands it.
Exactly. Now you have Palestinian Arabs, both Muslim and Christian, beginning to view themselves as a collective political bloc. You have Jewish settlers arriving as part of a highly organized international Zionist movement.
And sitting on top of both of them, you have the British colonial administration trying to manage or, mismanage the whole thing.
And this is where we have to define a few things, because you really can't understand the psychological shift without understanding the political promises being made.
Right, the British were making a lot of promises.
Right at the start of this era, you have the Balfour Declaration in 1917. This was a public statement issued by the British government announcing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Which is a massive turning point.
Wait, I'm just struggling with the sheer audacity of that. So
Yeah.
British, who are a colonial power sitting thousands of miles away in London, are essentially issuing a document making promises about a land that is currently overwhelmingly populated by an existing local Arab population.
Yes. Yes, they are. And you can imagine how that lands on the ground.
I mean, yeah.
For the newly arriving Jewish immigrants, it's this profound moment of international validation. It's a promise for safety and self-determination after literal centuries of persecution.
Sure.
But for the local Arab population, it feels like an imperial power is giving away the house they currently live in. It is a terrifying signal that their future is not in their own hands.
Which sparks intense pushback. The research points to events like the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt.
A major, major event.
And this wasn't just a minor protest, right?
Yeah.
It started with general strikes and economic boycotts, and then it escalated into a widespread armed insurrection against British colonial rule and mass Jewish immigration.
And the British crushed it brutally.
Right. And by the end of it, the local Arab leadership was exiled, killed, or imprisoned, which left the population incredibly fractured heading into the 1940s.
But look at what happens to the narratives during this Mandate era. This is the exact period where mutual fear narratives crystallize into something permanent.
The hardening of the identities.
Exactly. Palestinian Arabs are increasingly framed by British administrators and Zionist leaders as rebellious, primitive, or simply obstacles to a modern political project.
Wow.
Meanwhile, in Arab narratives, the Jewish immigrants are increasingly framed not just as new neighbors, but as existential threats agents of Western colonialism coming to displace them.
So to push on this a little bit, the framework really hammers home that these mutual fear narratives hardened during this specific British Mandate period.
Yes, it highlights that era heavily.
Was it the sudden introduction of this power vacuum, the Ottomans leaving and the British stepping in with their own agendas, that forced these loose local hometown and trade identities to suddenly become rigid, defensive national ones?
Absolutely. The research explicitly calls this the collapse of empire trigger.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Let's think about the psychology of a power vacuum. For 400 years, the Ottomans provided the overarching governing structure. It wasn't perfect, it was often oppressive, but it was known, it was stable.
You knew the rules of the game.
Right. When they fell, and the British took over via the Mandate system, there was suddenly no locally legitimate governance. You had bureaucrats in London making existential decisions about the future of the land.
The framework provides a very simple, very tragic mathematical formula for this, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Uncertainty plus lack of control equals instability.
Uncertainty plus lack of control equals instability.
Exactly. When human beings experience that level of systemic instability, when you genuinely do not know who will own your farm in 10 years, or what flag will fly over your city, or what language the laws will be written in, you cannot afford to just be John the blacksmith anymore.
You'd be wiped out.
Right. You are forced to band together, to draw rigid lines in the sand, and to form a defensive national identity just to survive the sheer uncertainty.
That formula perfectly, terribly sets the stage for 1948. The 1948 war, which Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe.
The defining trauma of the modern era for them.
This is the massive turning point.
Yeah.
The State of Israel is established, neighboring Arab states invade, and in the ensuing war, roughly 700,000 Palestinian Arabs flee or are expelled from their homes.
And those subgroups we talked about, they shatter and reform all over again, but this time across borders. You now have massive populations of refugees living in camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Jordan. You have a small population of Palestinians who remained inside what became the new State of Israel, eventually becoming citizens, but living under martial law for years. And you have the beginnings of a global diaspora.
And the prejudice narratives adapt to this new reality. The framing shifts heavily. Now they're framed as refugees, which the research knows carries a psychological framing of dependency, pity, and a total loss of political agency.
Or they're framed as lingering security threats on the borders.
And as we move forward through the decades from 1967, when Israel captures the West Bank and Gaza, through the 1990s, we enter the occupation and militancy era.
And the subgroups expand again.
Yeah, you have populations living under direct military occupation. You have the rise of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, operating from exile, engaging in international diplomacy, but also launching militant attacks, plane hijackings, and bombings.
Which creates this intense, incredibly polarizing dual narrative globally.
Right. Depending on who you ask in the 1970s and 80s, they are either ruthless terrorists hijacking the global order, or they are freedom fighters, utilizing the only violent leverage they have left to resist occupation and statelessness.
Which brings us to the modern fragmentation. The 1990s bring the Oslo Accords.
Let's define Oslo quickly, because it gets thrown around a lot.
Uh,
This was supposed to be the breakthrough, right? The famous handshakes on the White House lawn.
Exactly. The Oslo Accords were a set of agreements between Israel and the PLO that essentially tried to create a roadmap for a two-state solution.
Okay.
It birthed the Palestinian Authority, or PA, to provide limited self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza.
But the peace process ultimately collapses, leading to the Second Intifada and eventually to a massive internal political split.
A split that defines the modern landscape.
Right, which brings us to the modern era, where the subgroups are perhaps more geographically and politically distinct than ever. You have residents of Gaza, governed by Hamas since 2007, and living under a severe blockade.
You have West Bank Palestinians living under a highly complex, fragmented mix of Israeli military occupation and Palestinian Authority administration.
You have Palestinian citizens of Israel,
Yeah.
and you have millions in the diaspora.
And the core lesson the framework insists on here is vital. If you don't separate these groups chronologically and geographically, your analysis will be fundamentally flawed.
It's just too broad otherwise.
Exactly. You cannot simply say Palestinians are X. You have to say, in this specific time period, this specific subgroup was perceived as X because of Y structural conditions.
Okay, so that covers the who and the when. But knowing the actors isn't enough. We have to look at the exact mechanism of how this instability actually turns into targeted prejudice.
The machinery of it.
Yeah. So a localized fear sparks in a village over lost farm jobs. But fear alone doesn't sustain a century-long conflict. How does a legitimate material concern morph into generalized structural bigotry?
This is where we look at what the research calls the trigger layer. And what I really appreciate about this analysis is that it demands we look at tangible, real-world conditions first.
Not just vague hatred.
Exactly. It explicitly separates abstract ideological hatred from material triggers. Prejudice rarely just falls from the sky fully formed. It usually starts with something you can touch.
Let's look at the 1920s and 30s again. The text highlights land and migration pressure. You have an increase in Jewish immigration and land purchases.
Right.
But the material friction wasn't just, oh, a person of a different religion moved in next door. It was a massive economic disruption.
It was life-altering.
It was a shift from traditional tenant farming, where Arab families had worked plots of land for generations under absentee landlords, to entirely new ownership structures.
Right. When organizations like the Jewish National Fund bought land from absentee landlords in Beirut or Damascus, their mandate was often to settle Jewish workers on that land.
Which meant evictions.
It meant evicting the existing Arab tenant farmers.
So the local Arabs perceived, accurately, a loss of land access, economic displacement, and profound future uncertainty.
And then you add shifting economic models to that new collective farms, changes in wage labor, the introduction of industrial capital.
It's the classic, universally recognized trigger for social unrest. Are we being replaced economically?
Yes, add that highly combustible economic anxiety to the political collision of two competing national movements on the exact same land, and you have a structural collision.
But here's the pivot point. The framework asks, how does the anxiety of an evicted tenant farmer turn into a belief that all people of the incoming group are evil? Or conversely, how does the anxiety of an incoming immigrant turn into a belief that all locals are backwards and dangerous?
It points to the gap between perceived threat and reality.
The research provides a precise mechanism chain for this. I really want to walk through this because it's like watching dominoes fall.
Let's do it.
First, structural change. Land changes hands, power shifts.
Second domino, uncertainty and competition. Will I have a job next year?
Third domino, localized conflict. A fight breaks out over a specific well or a specific job site.
Fourth domino, fear amplification. Rumors spread to the next village.
Fifth domino, group generalization. They're all trying to destroy us.
And the final domino, prejudice formation. The fear hardens into a permanent worldview.
It's almost biological in its progression. The framework notes that scapegoating is a response to instability, not the origin of it.
Which is a crucial distinction.
Let me try an analogy here to see if I'm tracking this mechanism outside of the Middle East context. Let's think about a mid-sized American manufacturing town.
Okay, I'm with you.
A major auto factory closes down and moves overseas. The material trigger is macroeconomic restructuring and globalization. Real, tangible, structural change.
Right.
It causes massive uncertainty and competition for the few remaining jobs at the local diner or the hardware store. But people don't go down to the town square and burn an effigy of global macroeconomic trends.
No, it's too abstract. You can't punch a supply chain.
Exactly. So localized conflict starts. Maybe a new group of immigrants recently moved to the town to work in agriculture. Suddenly, the laid-off factory workers start blaming the newest group of immigrants for the economic depression.
The fear amplifies.
They generalize the entire immigrant group as job stealers, and a deep, ingrained prejudice forms.
That is exactly the mechanism. But let's take your analogy a step further.
Okay.
Imagine if the mayor of that town, who is terrified of being voted out because of the factory closure, realizes he can harness that localized anger.
Oh, wow.
So he actively pays for billboards blaming the immigrants? He passes local ordinances restricting where they can live. Now, you don't just have organic fear, you have the system actively weaponizing it.
Which accelerates the process completely. But wait, I have to challenge this a bit based on the text.
Go for it.
The framework argues that these material disputes, the land, the jobs, are the primary engine. But surely the cultural and religious differences played a huge role. I mean, without those obvious differences, would this level of conflict have sparked?
The research actually addresses this directly through what it calls identity and difference triggers.
Okay, what does that mean?
Yes, there were obvious, stark differences between local Muslim and Christian Arabs and the newly arriving Jewish immigrants, many of whom were coming from Europe with different languages, different clothing, different social norms.
Right.
But the text argues that these cultural differences merely made boundary formation easier.
They provided a sorting mechanism.
Precisely. They provided a handy visual and cultural shorthand to say they are not like us. But the differences themselves were not the engine of the conflict. The engine was the material reality of the power vacuum and the land pressure.
That makes a lot of sense.
The text establishes a rule it calls Kenny's clean separation. It demands that we distinguish actual material causes, like the collapse of the Ottoman state or land evictions, from perception-based escalations, like generalizing an entire population or engaging in zero-sum thinking where if they win, we lose everything.
So the culture clash was the kindling, yes, but the material disputes were the spark. That makes total sense. But here's the thing about kindling. Once the fire starts, if you want it to burn for 100 years, you have to constantly feed it.
You do.
Once that localized fear is amplified and generalized, it needs a vehicle to sustain itself across generations. It has to move from a panic rumor in a village to a formalized story told by millions. How do you turn a localized panic into a permanent structure?
You build a narrative, and then you encode that narrative into the law.
Which brings us to the narrative and system layers. This is where prejudice stops being a feeling and becomes an architecture.
Yes.
The research outlines 5 recurring stereotypes that were used to frame Palestinians over the decades. And importantly, it notes that these stereotypes weren't random. They were selectively deployed based on the specific political needs of the moment.
It's very utilitarian.
Let's look at them. Number 1, the obstacle or problem population. This wasn't necessarily framing them as cartoonishly evil. Rather, it was a deeply dehumanizing administrative framing. They were viewed as a demographic inconvenience standing in the way of a state project or modernization.
Which is brilliant, darkly, because it presses the emotional buttons of impatience and resentment in the dominant group. It makes the average person think, why are they always in the way of progress?
Right. Why are they making my life harder? Number 2, the security threat. This narrative spikes during periods of revolt like the 1930s or the Intifadas.
Oh, absolutely.
The narrative deliberately blurs the line between armed militants and everyday civilians. Suddenly, collective suspicion becomes completely normalized. A grandmother at a checkpoint is viewed through the exact same lens as a combatant.
The emotional button there is hypervigilance. If everyone is a potential threat, then any level of force used against them is pre-justified as self-defense.
It's a blank check. Number 3, primitive or backward. This is your classic textbook colonial narrative. It portrays the population as disorganized, tribal, or inherently incapable of self-rule.
And the most insidious part is how it treats their social fragmentation.
Yes, a fragmentation which was largely caused by decades of conflict, displacement, and systemic underdevelopment. But the narrative treats that fragmentation as proof of their inherent inferiority.
It presses the button of paternalistic superiority. You know, they can't manage their own affairs. They are prone to violence. Therefore, we, the civilized power, must manage them for their own good.
Number 4, foreign or not real. This is the narrative that simply denies their historical legitimacy, framing them as generic Arabs who just wandered in recently.
This one is incredibly structural.
The framework explicitly states this narrative is used to make dispossession easier to justify. If they aren't a real people with deep ties to the land, then moving them isn't a tragic exile, it's just a relocation. And finally, number 5, the perpetual victim or humanitarian burden. Now, this one actually sounds sympathetic on the surface, but the research argues it's deeply dehumanizing.
Because it strips them of agency.
Right.
It reduces a complex people with a rich culture, political desires, and intellectual life into mere suffering bodies. They become passive recipients of international aid. It replaces political understanding and demands for justice with mere pity.
So once these 5 narratives are established, the framework introduces the system layer. This is how the story is poured into the concrete of a society.
It literally becomes structural.
It happens through legal and administrative separation. Think of the permit systems in the West Bank today, the checkpoints, the dual legal regimes, where an Israeli settler is subject to civil law while a Palestinian neighbor is subject to military law.
It happens through displacement and land control mechanisms, zoning laws that dictate who can build a house, who can inherit property, who has access to water aquifers.
And critically, it happens through the embedding of these narratives into education and media so that the prejudice becomes common sense.
Exactly. When a child learns this framing in their textbooks and they hear it on the evening news, and it's repeated in the speeches of their political leaders, it stops feeling like a bias.
Right.
It starts feeling like an objective, scientific observation of the natural world.
I want to talk about the psychological defense mechanism behind this, specifically looking at that 4th stereotype, the idea of framing a people as not real to justify displacing them.
Sure.
Is the research arguing that these systemic stereotypes were intentionally designed by, like, a group of masterminds in a smoke-filled room? Or did they evolve organically?
If we look at the justification layer of the research, it answers this beautifully. It is almost never a smoke-filled room of supervillains rubbing their hands together.
That's reassuring, sort of.
Humans possess an incredible, almost terrifying capacity to build intellectual and moral frameworks to make our own harmful behavior feel reasonable and righteous.
Because nobody wants to be the bad guy in their own story.
Exactly. The framework notes that people use ideological claims, pseudoscientific arguments about culture, or moral reframing. They say, this harsh policy is just for security, or we have to do this for regional stability.
It sanitizes it.
Yes. What happens is that the system causes tangible harm, but the human conscience is profoundly uncomfortable with causing harm. So the outcome is misattributed.
Misattributed how?
The dominant group looks at the marginalized group and says, look at how they live, look at how they react. They are struggling under these constraints, therefore it must be their inherent nature.
Wow. Bias turns into belief, and belief hardens into an obvious truth.
And the bureaucracy is the ultimate shield. The bureaucracy makes unequal treatment feel completely ordinary, so the person enforcing it doesn't feel like an oppressor. They just feel like a clerk doing their job.
I'm not destroying a family's livelihood. I'm just stamping a permit. I'm not enforcing a blockade. I'm just checking the manifest.
Precisely.
Which is fair, right? I mean, human beings love simple explanations. I prefer a simple explanation for why my Wi-Fi isn't working. I want a single villain to blame, usually my router, rather than trying to understand the complex bandwidth constraints of my neighborhood's grid. We want a simple narrative.
We crave it.
But a system only works if people actively participate in it, or at least quietly go along with it. So why do ordinary, rational people, people who probably consider themselves deeply moral, go along with structures that enforce these narratives?
This is one of the most sobering parts of the document, the section on the actor and psychological layers. It forces the reader to look in the mirror.
It really does. The research categorically refuses to collapse all the actors into a single lazy bucket of they were all just bad people. It maps the field, identifying 4 distinct categories of actors and their motivations.
Let's hear them.
First, you have the true believers. These are the ideologues, the people driven by absolute moral, religious, or nationalistic certainty. They believe they are fulfilling a historic destiny.
Unwavering conviction.
Second, you have the opportunists. They aren't necessarily ideological. They're just exploiting the conflict for tangible, gain cheap land, political power, career advancement in the military or the government.
Right, the system benefits them materially.
Third, you have the fearful participants. They are acting entirely out of a survival instinct. They genuinely believe the us versus them panic.
They are reacting to the amplified fear.
And finally, you have the conformists, the followers. The people who go along with the system simply out of a desire for social belonging and to avoid rocking the boat.
And underlying all these actors are universal psychological mechanisms. In-group versus out-group bias. The deep psychological desire for order and control. And dehumanization mechanisms, using language that creates emotional distancing.
Like what?
Referring to people as swarms or demographic threats, rather than human beings.
Right. But what struck me most was the constraint layer. The framework asks the ultimate question. Why didn't more people resist the system?
Because the cost of dissent is astronomically high.
Right. The text lists the real-world consequences of standing up. Legal punishment, state violence, loss of your job or social status, being ostracized by your family, and the ultimate threat being labeled a traitor to your own people during a time of war.
It's social suicide.
Let me throw another analogy at you to unpack the fragmentation of responsibility concept the text mentions. It makes me think of a highly toxic corporate environment.
Okay, I like these analogies.
Imagine everyone in a company sees that the factory is secretly dumping toxic chemicals into the local river. But everyone just keeps their head down.
Right.
The guy on the factory floor says, I just pull the lever, I don't make policy. The accountant says, I just balance the books, it's not my call. The PR rep says, I just write the press releases. No single person feels fully accountable for the poison in the river.
The diffusion of responsibility.
Exactly. So my question for you, how heavily does this framework weigh the passive participant, the media consumer who just accepts the biased news, or the employer who quietly discriminates? How does it weigh them versus the active state actor or the armed militant?
That is a profound question, and the research is very clear on this. While the true believers and the opportunists are the ones who drive the system, they build the architecture, they write the laws, they fire the weapons, it is the conformists and the fearful participants who actually sustain it.
Right.
The passive participants are the concrete foundation of the entire structure.
A silent majority.
Exactly. The text points out that most people do not experience themselves as villains. The employer who tosses a resume in the trash because of an Arabic-sounding name isn't doing it because they consider themselves evil. They're doing it because they've absorbed the common sense narrative of the society, and breaking that norm is socially expensive.
That makes total terrifying sense.
Yeah. The entire system relies on the silent majority, fearing the social, economic, and legal costs of speaking up. Going back to your river analogy, if the accountant, the PR rep, and the guy pulling the lever all collectively said no, the chemical dumping would stop immediately. But the fear of losing their livelihood keeps the machine running.
Systems persist when neutrality becomes risky. That is a chilling takeaway. But how does a system maintain that level of fear among the general public?
That's the trick, right?
Yeah. If things are relatively quiet for a few years, won't the public start to question the harsh security measures?
You would think so.
But the framework argues that fear is actively maintained through highly visible, shocking events. Which brings us to the ammunition loop.
This is a devastating concept. It describes how the actions of a very few are used to eternally define the many.
The text outlines this ammunition loop as a powerful, tragic feedback cycle. Let's walk through it.
Okay.
It starts with a violent action by a subgroup. An extremist or militant faction commits an attack. That violence is immediately caught by media amplification and political framing.
It's on every screen.
That specific action is then generalized to the entire population. The political rhetoric says, look, this proves they are all like this.
The third domino.
That generalized fear is then used to justify harsh, sweeping security policies. Maybe a blockade is tightened, or a military incursion is launched, or more checkpoints are built.
And then what happens?
Those harsh policies cause conditions on the ground to worsen dramatically for everyday civilians. The economy tanks, medical care becomes scarce, daily humiliation increases.
Water cooker builds.
And those worsening conditions create profound desperation, trauma, and anger among the youth, which significantly increases the risk of further radicalization. And the loop repeats, decade after decade.
And the framework points out a critical flaw in human perception that keeps this loop spinning: selection bias.
Yes. The media prioritizes violence because, as the old saying goes, if it bleeds, it leads. Political messaging amplifies the threat to justify their security budgets or their hold on power. The most extreme actions are the most visible. Meanwhile, calm, ordinary, peaceful life, which makes up the vast majority of human existence even in conflict zones, goes completely underreported.
Right.
Nobody writes a front-page headline that says, millions of people in the West Bank went to work today, had dinner with their families, helped their kids with homework, and went to sleep.
Right. And this selection bias feeds directly into a series of massive, globally accepted misconceptions that the document painstakingly separates from reality.
Let's run through these myths versus realities because they are vital for anyone trying to actually understand the region.
Let's hear them.
Myth number 1, they are all the same. A monolithic block.
And the reality.
Reality. The population is highly diverse. You have the stark economic and political differences between Gaza and the West Bank. You have massive diaspora communities in Chile and Jordan in the U.S. You have secular communities, deeply religious communities, communists, capitalists, varied political affiliations.
Okay, myth number 2.
Myth number 2, they are inherently violent.
The biological fallacy.
Reality. Violence is tied to specific political factions and specific extreme conflict conditions. The vast, overwhelming majority are civilians who just want a normal, safe, prosperous life.
Myth number 3, they reject peace.
Reality. Views on peace vary wildly based on lived conditions, historical distrust, and what the word peace actually entails on the ground. If peace means accepting permanent subjugation, they might reject it. If it means genuine sovereignty, the views shift. It's about political leverage, not a fixed genetic trait.
Right, it's a negotiation. Myth number 4, they are defined solely by conflict.
Reality. There's a rich, vibrant cultural life, deep family structures, incredible culinary traditions, world-renowned art, poetry, and literature that exists completely outside the lens of war.
And the final one, myth number 5, they are passive victims.
Reality. They are active political participants, brilliant entrepreneurs, scholars, and cultural preservers with immense agency, constantly finding ways to adapt and survive.
These realities completely dismantle the ammunition loop's narrative.
But I want to zoom in on something you mentioned earlier and what the framework calls double standard awareness. The text points out a glaring hypocrisy in how we analyze violence. If a subgroup in population A, let's say a white domestic extremist group in the U.S., commits a terrible crime, the individuals who committed the crime are blamed and prosecuted. The news doesn't say all white Americans are terrorists.
No, it focuses on the individual perpetrators.
But if a subgroup in population B, a marginalized or occupied group, commits a crime, the entire population is blamed, punished, and sanctioned.
The entire group pays the price.
And so, as analytical readers, how are we supposed to look at extremist conditions and violence without naively ignoring it, but also without falling into the trap of biasedly overgeneralizing it?
This is where the text introduces what it calls Kenny's straight talk rule. It says that the disciplined, ethical, analytical position is to acknowledge reality at the subgroup level, but absolutely refuse to generalize at the population level.
Walk me through that. How does that look in practice?
You do not ignore the violence. If a militant group commits an atrocity, you state that clearly. To ignore it would be naive and intellectually dishonest.
Right.
But you must change the question you ask next. Instead of lazily asking, why are these people inherently violent, you must ask, under what structural conditions do extremist groups emerge?
You change the lens from inherent biological traits to environmental factors.
Exactly. You look at prolonged military conflict, you look at a total lack of political agency, you look at severe economic strangulation, lack of clean water, and deep, unhealed generational trauma.
You look at the soil it grows in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Analyzing these conditions is not about excusing the violence. The text is very explicit about that. Understanding is not endorsing.
That is a crucial distinction.
It is about identifying the structural roots of the violence so you can actually solve it, rather than attributing it to an inherent cultural flaw, which solves nothing. If you don't ask about the conditions, you end up doing exactly what the ammunition loop wants you to do. You collapse a complex political reality into a prejudiced stereotype.
Refuse to generalize at the population level. That is a powerful analytical mandate.
It's essential.
But to properly refuse that generalization, we have to actually know who the specific actors are on the ground. We have to map out the real organizations rather than lumping them all into one giant, scary monolith.
We have to categorize them.
And that is exactly what the organizational landscape section of the research does. Who actually represents whom?
Because if you don't know the landscape, you will inevitably look at a news report and conflate a humanitarian aid worker with an armed militant.
Right. The framework divides the landscape into 4 clear categories. First, political and governance. You have the Palestinian Authority, or PA, which governs parts of the West Bank. As we mentioned, it was created by the Oslo Accords. It's recognized internationally as an administrative body, though the research notes it is heavily criticized internally by its own people for inefficiency, corruption, and security coordination with Israel.
And the other political body?
Then you have the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. This is the historical umbrella group that engages in international diplomacy and is recognized by the UN as the representative of the Palestinian people.
Okay, that's category 1. Second category?
Armed and militant organizations. This includes Hamas, which has governed the Gaza Strip since a brief civil war in 2007. It has both political and armed wings. It is viewed externally as a terrorist organization by the U.S., EU, and others, while internally by its supporters, it's often viewed as legitimate armed resistance.
And PIJ?
You also have the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, which is strictly a militant group without the social or governance aspects of Hamas.
Got it. Third category?
civil society, and humanitarian. These are huge, vital, and almost completely ignored by Western media. You have UNRWA, the UN agency providing massive-scale education, healthcare, and aid to millions of refugees. You have vital human rights groups like PCHR and Al-Haq doing meticulous legal advocacy and documenting human rights abuses on the ground.
And the fourth category?
Diaspora and advocacy. Groups operating globally, like Students for Justice in Palestine on college campuses or the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK.
That is an incredibly complex, varied landscape of actors with entirely different goals, methods, and philosophies.
Exactly. But if you go out on the street right now in New York or London and ask a random person to name a Palestinian organization, because of the ammunition loop and media selection bias, they're almost certainly only going to name the armed ones.
Yeah, they will say Hamas.
They probably aren't going to name Al-Haq or a local university student group. The framework outlines a ground rule for analyzing these organizations.
Yeah.
How does it tell us to separate the concepts of representation, control, and visibility?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of how media and human cognition work, this ground rule is the key to media literacy. The text explicitly tells us to separate these three concepts because they are rarely the same thing.
Okay, break them down.
Representation, meaning who has the diplomatic, legal, or democratic mandate to speak politically for the people, is not always the same as control.
Right.
Control means who actually holds the guns, polices the streets, and governs the physical territory. And neither of those is the same as visibility, meaning who gets the most airtime, the most clicks, and the most headlines on cable news.
Wow. Representation, control, and visibility.
Conflating those three is exactly how the average media consumer ends up grouping 1 million school children, doctors, and civil servants in with an armed militant faction.
Because the visibility warps the perception.
Because the militant faction has the highest visibility, because violence makes the news and exercises territorial control because they have the weapons, the outside observer falsely assumes they represent the total ideological representation of the entire population. The document states that conflating these three is how complex political analysis collapses into a dangerous stereotype.
Complexity collapses into a stereotype. That is such a profound way to summarize the danger of the modern information age. We want the easy answer, we accept the visible actor as the only actor, and we let the X-ray machine lie to us.
We do it constantly.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by looking at the evolution of identity, how local, trade, and religion-based populations in the Ottoman era were forged into a rigid national identity by the power vacuums and broken promises of the British Mandate.
Right.
We tracked the material triggers, the literal, tangible disputes over tenant farming and economic survival that sparked localized fears. We examined the psychological and systemic layers, the bureaucracy and the conformity that turned those localized fears into justified structural prejudice.
The machinery of it all.
And finally, we separated the monolithic myths from the highly diverse reality of the people and organizations living on the ground.
And as we wrap up, I want to remind you, the listener, of the ultimate value of what this framework calls Kenny's integrating principle. We didn't just spend the last hour doing a history lesson on the Middle East.
No, we didn't.
We were looking at a masterclass in pattern recognition for human conflict anywhere in the world. The mechanisms we discussed today, how uncertainty breeds instability, how material conflict gets masked by cultural stereotyping, how fear is turned into legal structure by opportunists, and how narratives outlive their original triggers. These are universal tools.
They apply everywhere.
You can apply this framework to almost any systemic conflict you observe, any historical atrocity you study, or any polarized media narrative you consume today.
It really is a lens that permanently changes how you read the news. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. It's inspired by the very end of the research material, a section that asks us to look at the psychology of the dominant group.
That's a heavy question.
The text asks us to consider this question. How did identity become defined in opposition to this group?
Think about that for a second.
Think about how, in any prolonged systemic conflict, whether it's national, racial, or political, a point is reached where a marginalized group stops just being the opponent or the obstacle. They actually become structurally and psychologically necessary for the dominant group to define its own identity.
Right. We are the civilized ones because they are the primitive ones.
We are the defenders of order because they are the agents of chaos.
We are the unified nation because we are united against them.
If your entire sense of us, your national unity, your political purpose, and your moral justification is built entirely on being not them, what happens to your identity if the conflict actually ends?
What happens if the enemy is suddenly just a neighbor with equal rights, equal land, and equal humanity?
It is a terrifying prospect for the human ego to lose its defining antagonist. And it just might be the hidden, unacknowledged psychological reason why so many of these systemic conflicts seem utterly impossible to solve. Because solving the conflict means the dominant group has to figure out who they are without an enemy.
That is a question that requires a massive amount of introspection, not just for the actors in this specific region, but for all of us looking at our own societies.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the structural mechanics of identity, prejudice, and conflict. Keep your eyes open, stay curious, demand the how and the why, and always keep questioning the simple narratives that are presented to you as common sense. We'll catch you next time.